Okay, hi. And today's session will be on the supply chain management on um, basically the concept of impact of uncertainty in network design, particularly for the supply chain. Okay, so to identify issues associated with supply chain, normally today you can use computers or apps that can help us make judgment, putting input. We're going to look into this concept. We're not going to talk about the apps or the available software that helps in making decision, but what we're going to try to understand is how management of a company can come up with solution or options to help them assist in making decisions. So it's not when you make a decision, you know that uh, it can be calculated, okay, and it can also be a result of certain uncertainty within the environment. So for example, like today, uh, I, I didn't know that it's going to rain. Then it will affect the line connection and so on. Okay. Right. So when you talk about impact of uncertainty and when you're developing the design of your network or your supply chain, when you talk about supply chain is having access to facility, your location, your size, your distribution network. All these are critical roles in the supply chain management. Okay, so in every decision making process, once a decision is made, you normally you cannot change that decision. Okay, in the short term, it takes time to rectify whatever changes that happens. So it's important for companies or for organization to really calculate the risk of a decision being a bad decision or a good decision. It's basically an approach which people use to systematically help them in making decision, particularly for the supply chain. So things that people take into considerations, such as the demand, is there a market for it? The prices, the price, the exchange rates. If you're talking about importing materials or exporting products, um, and the change in the market. Okay, disruptive change or addition of a new competitor or a change in trend. So these are things that can affect a decision of an organization. So having the right information, having the right uh, what they call it, right information, the right statistics, can really affect, particularly if you're talking about large organizations. So on paper, when people talk about the changes, or when people talk about products, on paper it looks nice. Okay, you can always pump the numbers. It looks promising and so on. But sometimes when there are hiccups along the way, disruptions along the way. For example, as people, so, let's say your the what they call it, the human resource or the staff design, okay, or a disruption in your supply chain, sudden hike increase or in petrol prices because of some natural disaster. So all of these, on paper it looks nice, but when you face uncertainty or a sudden change or a sudden what they call it, a sudden change or sudden disruption, okay, it can really affect the decision making process. So as I said, I mean, you talk about decision, people make decision, but there are certain times when big changes happen and your decision may not be I mean, your decision may affect in the long term for a company. So we talk about the supply chain risk. What are the risks involved when you talk about supply chain, is the supply failure in particular. Okay, supply failure here is, if you're selling a product A, okay, a product A, um, and that product A does not fit, the requirement that is supposed to give. For example, uh, let's say let's say for bread packaging. Okay, you're packaging, white bread, but the bread inside is the, wheat bread, wholemeal bread. So these are supply failures that can happen. Okay, and then commodity price volatility. Okay, the prices, of commodity changes over time. If you notice about, import and export, I talk about the Malaysian scenario and the feed prices. So these are, the changes in pricing that happens over time. For Malaysia, the government looks into the put of, fixing certain price for petrol and so on. These are ways to ensure that, there are certain components where we try to control the changes, in terms of commodity prices, uh, in terms of, logistic issues. Um, Issues of internal product failures. Okay, biasanya macam recall. Okay, production kereta, masalah tingkap dan sebagainya. So, a batch of cars has to be recalled. So these are internal product failures that can result in, there are risk in the supply chain process. So if there are big recall, you find a sudden, let's say kereta A ni ada masalah tingkap because of the motor. So the motor, the supply chain process, if you remember the domino effect, okay, it goes back. Um, the causality, what is the cause of it? So it goes back. Let's say because of the motor for the window does not work. Okay, who is the supplier for the motor? Do you maintain that supplier, or do you find an alternative suppliers? If you need to find alternative suppliers, it will affect, selling off the cars and so on. And there are a lot of things that can happen. Another supply chain risk is, lower consumer spending. Issues like, nowadays you have this pandemic where people are spending much lesser, people are losing jobs, they don't have money to spend, and there is a sudden reduction in consumer for a particular product. And then last one here is natural disaster. Pandemic is one of them. If you look at the Malaysian scenario, issues seperti apa panggil tanah runtuh, a normal route that people normally take, and suddenly tanah runtuh, and cannot take that route, they have to take another route. It affects the process. You have to apply for license to travel from point A to point B using another route. For example, let's say after the 2014 flood in Kelantan, the train was not functional for quite some time. Okay, so that is affected in some of the process or some of the transportation needs. Okay, of the supply chain. So these are things that can result, which are risks to the supply chain. Okay, these are just example of, what are the normal supply chain risks that we face today. If you have a look here, most commonly is on supply failure. Supply failure, issues of logistics, issues of, non-compliance of products, uh, because, sometimes when you produce a product, you take many uh, parts and components from somewhere else. Okay, if those parts does not arrive on time and so on, it results in it increases the length of the supply reaching the destination on time. So going back to the, the causality effect, dominoes effect, supply failures is one of the most critical factor. Second here is on the commodity price volatility. Okay, the prices change. Harga naik turun, exchange rate, cost of production increases. These are things, increase in price. So how do people maintain a certain price? Sometimes people go for, the contract basis. You buy your item in advance for a specific price, and you maintain that price for, a certain period of time. So these are things that people look into. Another component is the internal product quality failures. These are mostly due to quality assurance, quality control within the production process of the supply chain or in the manufacturing process. So a failed quality control within an organization or within a manufacturing company will result in the in the product being recalled or the product being unable to be sold. So that's why quality control or quality assurance plays a big role in most manufacturing, basically in all manufacturing organization. So although they are not directly involved in the production process, but they are required to ensure that the quality reaches a certain standards so that the products produced are sold. So if you have, if your product cannot be sold, basically you're going back to the issue of losing on market and so on. Another aspect here is lower consumer spending. Uh, these are the concept also the same as the volatility of a nation or a country. The changes sometimes due to exchange rate. People have lower buying power. People losing jobs and so on. Consumers lose the ability to buy, to purchase. So these are normally due to large issues like recession. So it's not a secluded case, but when you have things like recession, you have when the economy falls and so on, you have a bulk of consumers who are unable to buy. So it goes back to the concept of upscaling, mass production. You're producing this certain amount to fulfill a certain amount of consumer, but when a sudden reduction of consumer being able to buy your product, you lose. Basically, you are forced to, you know, uh, you are forced to sell out, okay, your products, and that is where issue of loss happens. And if you was to turn that back ataupun on the concept of profit, so when the consumers are able to spend, okay, then you create that profit. So in large organization, they have to manage this. Okay, sometimes that's why that sometimes they have to be creative, uh, because in large organization, looking at ensuring the continuous ability to stay afloat. Okay, so this year you make profit, the next year you may make loss, but you're still moving, or basically you're still the company is still alive. Why? Because they put aside some of the profits to cover up their loss for the coming years. So that's why the concept of tabung and so on plays a big role. Um, Another effect of the supply chain for the regulatory compliance, a sudden change in government policy. For example, let's say I think a few years back, masa the no single use plastic, the policy came out. Okay, it affected the plastic punya, the plastic punya market. Okay, people had to change to alternative sources and so on. And alternative sources was not available, or the cost was too high, and this really affected the supply chain of the current plastic in the market. There are other aspects here. You have issues of the changes in energy costs. Since I said electricity tariff check naik, apa panggil, petrol naik and so on. And then you have IP infringement and intellectual property. Okay, you are doing something and suddenly someone says that you are stealing the idea, so it will affect the process. You have to hold on to your product, you cannot sell it off, and all these just are all other information, all the others risk that can, have a certain impact factor here. IT, the shortage in management talent. People are they're changing jobs and so on. You lose you lose your talent. And here lastly, on natural disaster. So each failure or each factor resulting in a supply chain risk, okay, have a certain impact or certain percentage of impact. This a supply failure is the highest impact to the supply chain, and compared to the effect of energy or the effect of petrol changes. So they are these are based on calculated risk. So going back to the concept of supply failure or issues. For example, here back in April 28th, okay, Honda Malaysia recalls over 77,000 units of vehicle for fuel pump replacement. What is the overall effect of this supply process? Um, the supply chain, okay, uh, internally it will affect Honda by itself because they have to change all these fuel supply replacement. They have to stop the initial fuel supply and find alternative manufacturer, or the manufacturer has to come up with the right fuel pump which is not which does not have problems. So and this, because of this, the recall and so on also affects the name of Honda. Okay, people wanted to buy, suddenly say, oh, hold on, don't buy yet, let them finish this issue first, and then before they buy. So the supply chain is basically affected in one way or another. Um, this is another issue lately, is on the issue of container shipping containers. Here they put as the title of Container Geddon, Armageddon, and so on. So a crisis of shipping. Okay, the prices of containers increase uh, because of sudden influx, borders opening, the what they call it, when borders starts to open, people want to resume businesses. So containers, you don't have enough containers traveling the world, you don't have enough ships, and they have an issue of having containers to support the international transportation or logistics. So you have places where people are starting to go back to the supermarkets and so on. You have to ensure that you have enough supply. So this is just one component because of an availability of shipping containers. Okay, lengthen the process of transportation. If, for example, here Walmart is a supermarket that will not have their product on time, so they are also macam dia pun kerja macam Christmas and so on. So products coming from, let's say, China need to be transport, but because of the process, because it takes more time, okay, and people have to pay more, so it indirectly affect the overall cost, and at the end, in terms of the profit and loss. So things that you need to consider during a supply chain risk, okay, disruptions, natural disaster, war, terrorism, labor disputes, supplier bankruptcy, okay, delays, the sudden increase in order, so you don't have the enough supply. Okay, system risk, system breakdown. Suddenly you have too many people coming onto the system, booking online and so on. Suddenly the system is being hacked. Forecast risk is inaccurate forecast. Uh, you know, for example, you're targeting within the next 2 months to receive your item, uh, and you always say that you will reach on time, but suddenly your forecast is inaccurate. Okay, so you didn't oversee issues like season. Suddenly it's a holiday season, end of the year, people are not going to work. So these are forecast list or forecasts which are inaccurate. We have another is on intellectual property. Okay, intellectual property, IP. You have a product that it's your own, but once you send it to country A, you cannot sell it because someone else is holding the intellectual property. So those are risks. You send one, this 20 containers, suddenly you cannot sell off. Procurement risk, it's mostly if you're talking about import export, yeah, exchange rate, um, issues when you buy from one supplier, you don't have options, supply A, B, C, and D. Okay, receivable risk. Okay, customers. Once one day when you do your survey, you find out that there are a lot of customers, but after a certain period of time, okay, these customers no longer want to buy, change in trend, and so on. Okay, inventory risk. Uh, inventory risk is, for example, you want to buy your product or you want to buy an item, do you go for bulk or do you just want to buy what is required at that particular time? You don't want to be holding your product for too long. Perishable products. Let's say if it's perishable products and then you buy it and people are not buying, the slow turnover rate. So these are inventory risk. Um, and this is capacity risk. Okay, capacity risk here meaning what are the input, the monetary input required to ensure the running process is there. Okay, offshoring here meaning you're looking at you know collaborating or passing some of the work to a third party to manage your risk. Okay, this is an example of natural disaster, the earthquakes and tsunami in Japan. Okay, it basically affected the whole country. So supply chain production of certain cars had to be shut down. So when you talk about manufacturing, the supply chain, you have contracts that you need to follow. And if this happen, what happens? So it's important also in the cost in the risk factor, especially when you're working, especially when certain area where they have certain risk, natural disasters involved, whether you need to put that in your contract process. This is an example, the hurricane which hit Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico had producers of certain components of medical components. So when you are only um, getting your supply from one source. Okay, the problems that ensure is that if that one source face a problem, you will also face that problem. So let's say you was to just buy, your banana from Philippines, and suddenly Philippines there's a big, there's an outbreak, uh, um, fungal outbreak, which resulted in the killing of the banana trees. So if you don't have alternative source to ensure that you can supply your contract, let's say you are supplying your contract to Aeon, but you don't have a banana, but you have a contract with Aeon that you need to supply banana. So if you are looking into just having one supplier supplying you, if that supplier is being disrupted, you will also be affected. And your effect can become worse if your contract states that you have to supply for whatever reason. So you have to ensure that you have other alternatives, or a second line, a third line that you can source your material. um, so it's important to also to be able to develop a supply chain plan. Okay, so if you've gone through HACCP, you've gone through GMT, it's the same process, whereby here you're looking at a supply chain. What is the plan, what needs to be, what is required for you to plan out. So it's a step-by-step process. Okay, so it's important to create a disaster response and recovery time, recovery plan. Um, I think this is common in all organization. It does not just cover supply chain. If you even if the concept of HACCP, okay, you identify your hazards. Okay, what are the analysis or the KPIs that you need to look after? If that is affected, what is your solution? And your solution is basically your recovery plan. So if you notice that the concept of HCCP or the concept of a recovery plan are almost similar, okay, you are ensuring that you have the ability to overcome the catastrophe. um, as we noticed that one of the biggest risk is with regards to supply chain. When you talk about supply, you're talking about suppliers, you're talking about logistics, you're talking about what is involved in the supply chain process. So if you have a supplier, you have to make sure that your supplier also have their response or prepare these plans. So to ensure that their product can, I mean, that you can get your product on time, or you can, and you won't be affected by, uh, issues or problems that can happen in the future. So it's good to understand your supplier, whether they are able to outsource. For example, if their own plant is affected, can they produce the contract, or can they produce the product that they want to send to you, even though their production plant is affected. So it's good to also understand your supplier, not just to look at the products, but to look at whether they are capable to supply. Another aspect that you need to consider when you talk about disaster or supply chain disaster is what is the effect of it uh, on your organization's reputation. Okay, so um, some some companies or some organizations look into this aspect very highly. Okay, they look at you know um, what can affect the long term, the branding of their company. So they look at, for example, if there's a sudden, I mean, a few years back, issues of milk, uh, maybe formula coming from China, okay, contamination issues. So because of that, the company closed down, okay, because they were not able to manage that impact, coming from the coming from the threat resulting from the contamination issue. So it goes back to planning. Okay, if you have a quality control put into place where you follow all these procedures, SOPs, and so on, uh, you can manage and reduce the risk. But if the risk happen, you have to, if the risk happen, you have to face it. Okay, you investigate what was the issue, what was the occurrence, and with those information, you can convey those message to your consumers. So you look after your name. So your name plays a big role. Okay, the brand plays a big role. If the brand is affected, you're talking about the whole company coming down. Okay, this is if you look at examples of other examples of supply chain risk. Even if you're supposed to compare country to country, for example, like China, IP infringement is high. Okay, you have your product and what you want to produce in China, but China has a high rate of IP infringement. Barang tiruan, barang grade AAA, and so on. Go to the United States. Okay, IP infringement is much lesser, probably because they have a much higher control, in terms of pirate and so on. Okay, so these are just examples. You can see the differences of the United States. Here it says lower consumer spending compared to China, most probably because of of the economy being very volatile. You have people, you have issues of recession, you have issues of inflation, a sudden fall of certain area or certain uh, economy sector, compared to China, which does not have that threat. So energy costs, okay, if you compare with energy costs, United States, because the price of, petrol and so on is left to the market, electricity. So these are, you can see that different places have different risk factor or different percentage of this risk, um, being things that you need to monitor. For example, if you was to produce your product in China, you have to really plan well in terms of IP infringement. You have to also plan well in terms of product quality. So how do you ensure quality control when you produce your product in China? Okay, internal product quality failures. So to compare this to the United States, here, okay, you have lesser issues with regards to product quality. You have the product quality, but the price may be higher. So these are the things you talk about, supply chain risk. Significant supply chain disruptions can reduce your company's revenue, cut into your market share, inflate your costs, send you over budget, and threaten production and distribution. You can't sell goods you can't manufacture or deliver. Such disruptions also can damage your credibility. So it goes back to the name. Okay, when the effect, a disaster resulting in your name being tarnished. Okay, your name is no longer in the good books. So the overall effect is can be felt much longer time. So even up to a point that the company can go bankrupt and close down. Okay, this is just an example of uncertainty risk factor. Okay, here 97 raw material shortages. Okay, night glitch in demand planning software. So you're not producing enough shoes and so on. So these are just examples. Um, so when you uh, try to understand impact of uncertainty, okay, impact for uncertainty when designing a network in supply chain management, uh, you know, you have to have, that's why people are always saying you put your eggs in many baskets, okay, not in just one basket. So when you talk about supplier, you have supplier A, B, C, and D. If a disruption occurs to one, we still have another two third to produce your product. Okay, to supply the raw material. Same concept with manufacturing. Okay, you may want to manufacture in plant A, B, and C, or a manufacturing plant having a line A, B, C, and D. So if one line is disrupted, you can still continue because you have other line. The distribution network, okay, country A, B, C, and D. So if let's say country B has suddenly have natural disaster, you're not that affected because you're also distributing to country A and C. Same as retailing and same as your customers. So um, when you talk about manufacturing, when you talk about upscaling, okay, you try to reach as many markets as possible, but you have to ensure that you have the ability to supply. So it's different compared to small businesses where you have only one raw material supplier, you only have one line, you distribute just from one shop, and you have to see your customer is more localized, so it's not that diverse. So here you're talking about flexibility, the ability to be flexible. You have options. So for the basically the purpose is to reduce risk. Okay, these are just risk mitigation strategies. You're talking about having good collaboration. You can leverage out. Uh, you have if you're talking about like right now, people are talking about large scales. You have to ensure that you get quick information. You got I mean your information delivery is fast. So these are things that people consider. Um, this is the idea of a discounted cash flow analysis. I'm not sure if I'm going to go into detail into this. These are all theoretical numbers for us to understand how decisions are made, how to compare when you make decision one and or here option one and option two. When you make decision, how does it affect you in the long run? There are calculation or formula that you can try to look into. Okay. This okay here we talk about discounted cash flow analysis. Um, you're trying to evaluate what is your net present value now and your net present value in the future. Okay, so your investment now and what you get in the future. These are paper based, basically based on formulation. So you want to compare if you're using cash flow A or cash flow B. If you're investing A and you're investing B, what is the long term effect? Sometimes there is a minimum number of investment that you need to make. If you make too much investment, you still get the same price. So, but overall, you're losing out. Okay. These are all just calculation. I mean, I won't be doing any questions on this. You can try to read it out. Okay, let me find. All right. So, what is a net present value? Net present value is a financial metric that seeks to capture the total value of a potential investment opportunity. So, as I said, you're talking about what is the current investment now, and let's say you expected to see what is the impact from your investment now in 3 years' time. So there are calculations that people can use, but it's based on the concept of there will be no uncertainty involved. So the idea behind NPV is to project all the future cash inflows and outflows with regards to the investment and discount of future cash flows to the present day, and then add them together. So the basic idea is just to identify whether the investment you put in, I mean, does it bring impact or is it beneficial? So these are based on paper or theoretical calculation. All right, so I'm not going to go through this with the detail. It may this require some time for you to really understand the calculation. So there are certain numbers when the value of what do you call it? Net present value is bigger than zero. Okay, it has value. Okay, so you get whether you want to accept the project or not. So if the value today and the value 5 years down the road is the same, then there's no what they call it impact factor there. So people may look at other decision whether, I mean, because you say you buy a, you buy a let's say you buy a property today at 500,000. If the property says 500,000, okay, your investment may be better elsewhere, because you're looking at, when you're talking about investment, you want to make sure that what you invest today grows tomorrow. Alright, so I'm not going to look at this. This is just examples. And just stay through. Okay, these are just theoretical calculation of risk factor into when you're looking to making investment. Alright, these are basically the same concept with different approach. Okay, so decision tree. So the whole this all of this concept, we do all this calculation is basically associated with decision. Okay, when do you want to invest? Do you invest now or you invest 2 years down the road? What is the effect? So it's the same concept as HACCP. Okay, you find where your risks are, what is your alternative. Let me look at this. Have a look. Okay. Alright, so we're just gonna look at, okay, supply chain disruption. Okay, this is just a repetition of the previous slides. So we talk about disruptions. It's hard to predict. You can do based on calculation, but disruptions are something that happens. Natural disaster, of natural disaster, COVID and so on. These are all can affect this supply chain. So how do you reduce the risk factor um, of a supply chain disruption? One of the concept is to look into segmentation, okay, supply chain segmentation. Um, so when you talk about segmentation, you don't what do you call it? Tak mengharapkan satu supplier. Okay, you're looking at multiple suppliers. So I've explained this previously in previous slides. So and you have to, I mean, you break down your segment, because as I said, you putting more, you putting your eggs in many baskets rather than one basket. So when you segmentize, you spread out your investment, okay, or you spread out your risk. So if component A, okay, you have possible 10 kind of 10 options. So from that, instead of just having one option, if the risk or disruption affected that one option that you have, then you will basically go broke. But when you have, let's say, 10 options, okay, normally, factors of the risk affecting it may just affect, let's say, if you have 10, it may affect only just one. So you reduce your risk by 1 over 10. The same concept is when people, plant durian, they plant a variety of durian on one plot of land to cover as long as possible. So if let's say they put just one type of durian, that may give fruits, let's say, from June to July. But they plant other varieties which can give fruits much earlier in the season. Let's say start from April, May, June, July, and then end of the season, August, September. Other what they call it, other durian type. Okay, so that is the concept of segmentation. You break down your market, you break down your supply chain, you break down your product diversification. Okay, so this is just for you to read. Okay, this quantification, uh, uh, risk quantification is the same as the concept of the P. Previously, you're looking at what are the risks involved, how do you quantify them? Risk A, risk B, risk C, which is the most highest risk, which is a much lower risk. So there are calculations that people use. Okay, when you talk about risk, you're looking at probability of risk occurring and the impact of the occurrence. So probability of risk occurring, for example, musim hujan, you know that the risk is happening end of the year. What is the impact? Okay, the impact of it, you cannot tanam chili, for example. So if people was to, if the farmers was to tanam chili end of the year when it's raining, the impact is you don't have chilies. So you have to calculate, you know, the probability. Like if you plant chili, let's say in June, then it's not going to be affected, and you have a better, reduced risk. So these are just based on calculation. This is the basic concept when you are to identify risk. Okay, this is just a process of you wanting to identify or create a risk factor. You can, you have, let's say when you identify your risk, you have risk A, risk B, risk C. Um, you can quantify this risk to identify whether it's a high risk or a low risk. Okay, so you two main components go back. Okay, probability of risk occurring and the impact of the occurrence. So if the probability of the risk occurring is high and the impact of the occurrence is high, then you have much higher number, which is why the high risk. So this is just based on calculation, but as I said, it's not based on a number. It's based on the ability of you to analyze. Okay, what is the level of the risk? Okay, so assigning these levels to categories and then calculate the organizational supply chain risk score. So you have risk A, B, C, and D, and so on, and you calculate. So you identify these are the risks. These are the main risks. Let's say risk A is the most important one to ensure that it can be reduced. Item number 4. Okay, this is a much lesser risk. So these are things that people use to measure, to justify, when they make decision. Okay, this is a way of just measuring. So if the impact is high, probability is high, then you have a higher impact factor or you have a higher risk. Okay, another concept here is on scenario planning. Okay, you from your risk or from it, you create scenario. These are mostly hypothesis driven. It is qualitative in one aspect. Okay, you base it on information that you have. Different people may have different approach in scenario planning, mainly due to initial information or initial data that they have. Okay, so when you talk about scenario planning, the first thing that you need to identify is what is the focal question. What are you trying to question? What is the for example, here example do okay here it says here, should we expand to China and open a certain number of distribution center. Okay, for example, let's say when McDonald's came into Kelantan, okay, they only had in Kota Baru. So now you can see that they're expanding further because they're adding more distribution centers because they know that the market has increased. Okay, people want to buy and so on. Um, First, you have to find the question: do you want, or do we go into, or do we add more distribution center, or do we add more cafes? Okay, another phase look at the driving force. Uh, okay, internal or external factors that will shape future supply chain dynamics. For example, as in terms of McDonald's, what are the driving force? One is the customer. You look at the customer in Kelantan. Previously, you're looking at just during holidays, but now you could see the trend. What are driving force? The customers normally end of the month or on the gaji and so on. There is an increase in the consumer numbers. When people understand this, they know when they need to buy items and so on, in terms of procurement. Okay, and then you develop the scenarios. From this post information, you create scenarios. Okay, what happens if there is a sudden increase in consumers? Okay, do you add more items, or do you slow down the booking process or the ordering process, so you reduce people coming in? So these are things that people they develop their scenarios, and then they identify the implication. For example, when you talk about fast food, let's say when the material is not enough. Okay, fast food, the concept there should always be the food there. Okay, you cannot have no food item, it has to be there. But what happens when there is a sudden increase in purchase, let's say, of what do you call it, of prosperity burger? So buka pukul 10, sell prosperity burger, tengok pukul 12 dah habis. uh, what is the implication of this? Okay, implication, people look at implication and say, oh, hari pertama 12 habis, hari kedua 12 tengah hari habis, hari ketiga 12 tengah hari. People will suddenly say, okay, if it's after 12, they will not go anymore. Okay, they don't buy prosperity burger. They all say, oh, tak nak pergi lah sebab pukul 12 dah habis. So what happens is, if the outlet suddenly say, oh, people are buying, they have to order more product to come, suddenly they will have a surplus of material, surplus of product. So and suddenly they say, oh no, people are not coming in after 12 because they're no longer buying. So this really basically affects uh, affects that process. So when you talk about going back to uncertainty on network design, this is something that I think that we can take back. A supply chain design decision cannot be easily changed in the short term. So a supply, the decision, when people come up with decision making, okay, they have to put all these calculated risks. They have to make all this assumption. They have to make all this, try to understand scenario, because once a decision is made, to change that decision back is not easy. Okay, you have to create in the new scenario, try to identify what will happen if you make that decision. So the decision process on creating network design and supply chain, okay, decision has to be clear, has to be concise, and has to be walked through. Okay, after a certain period of time, when you find it does not work, it takes time to go back. Okay, and and when you talk about supply chain, uncertainty does happen. Okay, uh, you know exchange price, cost of raw material, the market competition. So today you have you don't have competitor. Okay, the next 10 days you have new competitor. It reduce your market share. So over a period of time, okay, this will affect supply chain. For example, you don't want to be continuous ordering 100 kilos of patty if you know your market has shrunk to just 50 patties. 50 patties. So these are things that that uncertainty, the concept of uncertainty in design. Um, so it's important also to be flexible in the supply chain, so you know what's changing, what's happening, and so on. As I said, okay, this is art and science. It's you're using both qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative is you have to understand the um, you know uh, the non-physical factor, okay, human factor, um, and the science, hard science, you're looking at numbers. How do you convert your qualitative to quantitative? Because in the end, if you make decision making, there has to be a certain reason for you to bet onto. Okay, you cannot just make decision. I mean, small businesses make that decision. Okay, I want to do this change. But when you talk about large organization, you have to create, you have to identify, and you have to calculate before that decision is made. So the concept is, I mean, it's both an art and science. Okay, art meaning that you have to make that decision based on what you feel, but what you feel is also dependent on the data or the information that you receive. So if you receive half cooked information, so let's say inaccurate information, then your gut feeling will be such and such, and you might make the wrong decision. So it covers both sides. Okay, the qualitative and quantitative. All right, so basically that is for the class today. Okay, for next week we will have, I will do a quiz, um, but the quiz is from the class. Okay, the lecture from the class for the class next week. So we have a quiz then, and if you want to look into detail, if you go to eCampus, okay, if you go to eCampus, there is um, what do you call it? If you go to eCampus, I've put up information with regards to marks, okay, and the topic is covered by me and also by Dr. Parsan. So if you have any question, don't hesitate to let me know. And sorry for today, as we don't have I don't have good network, so I had to copy this and share it later on. Okay, then, so thank you very much for listening, and hope to see you in the next session. Okay, bye bye.